everyone, welcome to another episode of The No Man's Land. My name is Angela Ramirez, and I am the journalist here at the site. Today we are going to be talking about something that everybody has probably been kind of thinking, but nobody has really said yet. That's not true. There's a lot of people who've been saying it. It's just fewer and far between that there is currently some sort of communist radicalization going on in the United States. So that's what this blog is actually about. We are talking about specifically Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and For the People. You guys probably have heard of, obviously, Black Lives Matter and Antifa. For the People might be something you're not as familiar with. I have been kind of looking into this group because there is a group, kind of like a cell, in my area, and I attended a protest for expecting to see Antifa at the protest, which they were there, but what I noticed was that there's this group called For the People who use kind of like red hands. They'll put like red paint on a hand and put it on their face. It's supposed to be like an indigenous rights group. Anyway, so basically this group has roots all over the United States. There's like, I can't remember exactly how many chapters off the top of my head. We do have an article on it on the site, but this group has chapters all over the U.S., and they just so happened to be like organized by the Maoist Communist Party. Now, who is running the Maoist Communist Party? I'm not sure 100% yet. It's an ongoing investigation. But that said, obviously Maoism, for those of you who don't know, it's a communist ideology based on obviously Marxism, but it was made famous by Mao Zedong, who was a 20th century Chinese dictator, and he killed, I believe the estimate is about 60 million people, some of which were through state-sanctioned violence, but the majority of which were the majority of which starved because they had killed off a number of the high-producing farmers and proceeded to attempt a collectivized agriculture approach, very similar to what we saw in Soviet Russia in the 1920s. Anyway, so basically this group is based off of Chinese communist philosophy is what I'm trying to get at, and I'm being very ranty about it. Sorry. Anyway, so the article basically is about the uptick in communist radicalization throughout the United States, specific focus on Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and this For the People group. So I'm going to go ahead, like I always do, and I'm going to read through the blog, interject my personal thoughts kind of in between the facts that are laid out. And obviously, you guys are always welcome to ask questions. I do answer questions. If you're interested in the sources, I won't be going into the sources unless I feel they're relevant. But if you guys want to check them out, you're able to on thenomanzone.com. All of these blogs have a crazy number of sources with them because I understand how important it is to not just make blanket statements that are based on assumptions. I think that it's really important to kind of, you know how in math they talk about showing your work when you do a long equation. I think that that's kind of what sources are, is like showing your work and being able to go, here's how I got from point A, which is observing the situation, to point B, which is a conclusion on what's happening. And here's all the steps I took to get there. So if you guys are interested in the sources, you can find them on the site. Let's get into the blog. August 2020. Over the past 3 months, the United States has seen a sudden surge in radical left and anarchist groups seeking direct, violent, and nonviolent action. These groups include Antifa, Black Lives Matter, For the People, and Movement for Black Lives, among others. Although they are marketed as social justice groups and anti-fascist heroes, advocating for political and humanitarian rights of marginalized communities, however, they are truly just groups organizing under classic Marxist class struggle agenda items. Kind of a long-winded sentence. Anyway, while the number of root organizers of these groups are minimal, the use of social media as a marketing and radicalization tool has allowed propaganda and organizing information from these groups to travel quickly, while simultaneously building a mobilized base of increasingly radicalized citizens to push policies and social culture. So I'm going to break that down because I know that was kind of a lot of information. Basically, it's kind of laying out exactly what is kind of happening in America. Basically, there's certain groups specifically pointing out today Antifa, Black Lives Matter, For the People, and the Movement for Black Lives, which, if you guys aren't familiar with the Movement for Black Lives, that is a organization. It's a 501c3 that has a fiscal sponsor through a nonprofit organization, basically, that is known for socialist policy advancement. They actually hold like webinar chats with Venezuelan representatives, whatever that means, on a regular basis for people who like add their email address. You can get signed up and openly view one of these little meetings between this group and these Venezuelan people who apparently are a part of the Communist Party. Anyway, so Movement for Black Lives, the reason that they're included is because they kind of fall under this Black Lives Matter umbrella of left-wing political solutions, political and social solutions, all of which are very much based after Marxism. And, what they're doing right now is creating and trying to pass a Breathe Act, which I won't go into all the details of the bill here, but I will do like a blog on that soon. So this Breathe Act basically is supposed to fall in line with, I believe, like anti-police brutality, but there's more to it than just that. Anyway, Patrice Cullors, who's one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, recently did a Now This video in which she was imploring people to pass the Breathe Act. So it has been endorsed by Black Lives Matter. Now, interestingly enough, Movement for Black Lives, I've checked into their their donation page on their website, and it is processed through Act Blue. And on the checkout page, actually, it says that some of the funds that they receive go to Black Lives Matter. So that's interesting because that means that this organization, which apparently on paper is a different organization from Black Lives Matter, is actually receiving funds and then allocating those funds to Black Lives Matter. And it also just so happens that this organization is a fiscally sponsored 501c3. And we all know that I have written many blogs on what is going on with fiscally sponsored 501c3s and how these shell nonprofit corporations are presenting themselves as charities and essentially doing absolutely nothing. The money is moving through. Whether or not it can be justified is a whole different story. Anyway, there's blogs on my site. You guys can check that out, and I will do another video. I think actually we do have a video. It's called, Black Lives Matter, Shell 501s. I think it's called Open Source Politics, Shell 501c3s, and George Soros, and that's what that video is called. And I'm pretty sure I have it both on BitChute and YouTube, so you guys can check it out. Anyway, super long-winded. Basically, what I'm trying to get at here is that these groups are basically presenting themselves as social justice groups, saying that they have solutions to problems, in many cases, not all, but in some cases, legitimate issues in America's socioeconomic fabric, right? They're saying that police brutality needs to be fixed. Most Americans, I think, agree with that. They say that, we need to find ways to rectify the long-term impacts of racism and segregation that has had on both the generations of people in American culture, are the Black Americans in American culture, with that, how we can, heal from that. I think that is a fair thing to say. And also, the other aspect of this argument is how do we rectify, from an economical and political and, developmental perspective, how do we fix the issues that are in the communities that were once segregated, that have long since had struggles recovering? How do we fix that? right? I think these are all pretty valid questions that, if brought up in a reasonable, like, and I know that saying reasonable is kind of controversial. Let's say moderate perspective, right? A moderate perspective, if it was brought in a, you know, not so demanding and, dare I say, violent manner, that there would probably be a lot more progress, but it hasn't been presented that way for many reasons. One of which is, in my personal opinion, the fact that these movements that are pushing for this reform are largely Marxist. Excuse me, hold on. A lot of these corporations that are pushing for change are largely very left-leaning groups, and I think that there is not enough of a push from conservatives to make this change. The thing about conservatives is they are very hands-off. It's very much like, I'm going about my business, you go about your business. And that's total generalization, right? Generalizations are fun, and sometimes they can be effective. And I think that that's probably an oversimplification of that. But I think that for sure conservatives are not as much involved in the day-to-day, like, kind of push for police reform, for social improvements, of like community improvement kind of projects. Instead, a lot of times money is donated, and as a result, like, you don't have as much of an impact when you just hand somebody some money, as opposed if you spend like an hour of your day, like, just for example, an hour of your day helping them with something, right? So that's one of the reasons I think that this is having such a hard time with reform. I mean, if you look at around the country, there has been reforms that have happened in terms of defunding the police, but as a result, the violence has gotten worse, the crime rate has gotten worse, violent crime is through the roof in places like New York and Chicago and Minneapolis, and San Francisco is and has been going down the drain. Right now, we have large exoduses from places like New York and New York and Los Angeles. Hundreds of thousands of people are leaving these big cities, and they're going to conservative-run states, right? Because of what has happened, not just obviously with these riots and stuff, but for other reasons as well. Regardless, I think that this is kind of a symptom of a bigger issue, which is these very left-leaning groups constantly pushing for policy changes, demanding things through mob rule. I mean, we saw this at Evergreen College not very long ago, where, Mr. Weinstein, he pretty much called it for what it is, which is like some sort of really weird radical left like movement. And now that has not just stayed confined to obviously colleges. Now we see this in the streets of Portland, and we don't just see it with college graduates and college students. We're actually seeing it with high school students. Like the Pacific Northwest, I think Youth Liberation Front is what they're called, but it's like a bunch of kids, right? It's a bunch of kids who are running around and destroying shit in the name of fixing problems that they have these radical solutions to. So basically, that's that. Now, I think that another part that we should consider talking about is that the fact that there's only a limited number of root organizers, right? So I kind of talked about this in my my video, Open Source Politics. And I think that open source politics is something that mainstream political people are going to have to start paying attention to, because it's being applied, just not by mainstream politics, right? So this concept of a leaderless movement, which a lot of these Antifa, Black Lives Matter movements are, they claim to be very hands-off from the people who founded it, right? No one person has any more control or power than the other person. Now, I've brought up in past articles the fact that the Pareto Principle has been shown to be pretty much universally found throughout all kinds of pretty much aspects of life, right? The Pareto Principle is not just a capitalist principle, but it's also found, in the natural world. At least that's my understanding of it, right? Is that wherever you look, basically 80% of the causal effects, or the causal result, 80% of the results are caused by 20% of causal effects, right? This is the Pareto Principle. So if that is true, right, which it has been pretty much universally accepted as true. I know a lot of things that are universally accepted as true, like gender, are currently being reconsidered. But for the sake of conversation and our sanity, we're going to say Pareto Principle pretty much has been universally accepted as true. So if that is really the case, if the Pareto Principle is accurate, that means that 80% of the causal of the results of these riots, right, and violence, direct action kind of approaches, violent direct action, that means that 80% of those events have to be caused by 20% of the people involved, right? So, if that's true, that means there actually are root organizers and people who contribute more than others to both organizing and funding and strategy, things like that. So, we really, for the sake of conversation, and, I think the sake of this point, there's really only a limited number of people organizing. And the use of social media as a marketing and radicalization tool has allowed propaganda and organizing information information from these groups to travel quickly. Also, we all know that there's this huge issue all over social media with like shell accounts where people aren't verified as like a real person. So you get like somebody who makes like, they have their personal profile like on Twitter, right? But they also have like, like 2 or 3 stupid like activist accounts where they go on and just argue with people about their political ideology or whatever it is that they're going to argue about. And so that's how you get all these people with like an egg emoji as their freaking profile picture, and they joined last month, and they want to argue with you on political topics. And so what happens is you get this false sense of a movement that is much bigger than it really is, and much more serious than it really is, because half these people, because basically the movement looks bigger than it is on social media. If, right, we take into consider the fact that we only really have, a few, I'm definitely not belittling what is going on, but we only have a select few cities right now that are really suffering. And they are really suffering, and that it needs to be handled for sure. I cannot imagine that the citizens living in these cities that have increases in gun violence and riots like Portland 86 nights in a row, right? But what I'm saying is basically that on social media, if you were to look on social media, if you were to look on Twitter, spend some time on Twitter, you would think that this is a nationwide, like becoming a really nationwide issue, right? But if you are somewhere like in Colorado where I am, or, maybe southern Huntington Beach, California kind of thing, or, Texas, you're not seeing this, right? Or maybe only in Austin a few nights, right? But what that means is that social media is being leveraged to make this movement not only reach more people and propagandize more people, but also to utilize, like, how like in network marketing, like this is what I think about this movement. Like, how in network marketing, like before they have somebody come on stage, they like hype them up and they're like, oh my gosh, he did this, and then he did this, and he's $1 million earner, and he has only been in the business like 2 months, and he got the car because he made so many sales, right? So they're like hyping up this person, and then by the time he comes on stage, like if you don't really get what they're up to, then you're like, wow, this guy is like awesome, and I'm going to make $1 million now because he's going to teach me, right? So that's kind of what's being done with this movement. is they're kind of like hyping the movement on social media through lots of activist accounts, lots of propaganda, a lot of propaganda, right? And obviously there's like these other like social justice organizations like Movement for Black Lives that supports Black Lives Matter, and then there's the DSA, and there's the Afro Liberation Front, like, right? But we don't know who is actually really behind these organizations. We don't know how closely knit, right, at least some of these organizations have become. Well, even though on paper they're different organizations, right? So it's important to consider that, I think, because, obviously propaganda via social media has been a very common tool by certain dangerous individuals, and it's not necessarily out of the question that it could happen here in the US, for those of you who know what I'm referring to. Anyway, so moving on. A communist movement led by the supposition that the USA is built on white supremacy. So this is kind of the whole argument behind this communist movement, is that the United States was built on, first, right, slave labor, because slavery was a trade here in the US in 1776 when America was founded. I don't acknowledge the other founding date that is floating around. 1776 is when the United States Declaration of Independence was written, and therefore that is when America was founded. So anyway, in 1776, slavery was an issue, right? And it is pretty much widely known that as soon as the war for independence from Britain was finished, the Civil War was launched, right, to end slavery. So there was a number of factors playing into it, but that was pretty much the leading cause of going to war. So basically, this organization, or this group of organizations, say that America is a nation built on the idea of white supremacy, everything from its political stances to its architecture to its Judeo-Christian foundational ideology to our economy. Everything is based on white supremacy, according to this movement, right? So this is important to note because, as with all Marxist movements, the classic theme of proletariat versus bourgeoisie appears in today's modern communist movement. Traditional Marxist attacks on imperialism, as seen in revolutionary Russia in the 1920s, are found throughout today's movement in the United States. I'm going to pause there because I think that that's kind of an important thing to note. Here in America, what we're seeing in the United States, what we're seeing is a lot of people saying that America is an imperialist nation, and that that has to do with us coming here and taking this land, right, from the Native Americans, is the argument coming from this far left, these far left groups. What a lot of people don't realize, because a lot of people haven't studied Russian history, is the fact that imperialism was an argument used by the revolutionary Russian soldiers, right, against the Tsarist regime. They said that the Tsarist regime was imperialist and thus also and also capitalist, and so thus the whole system must fall. And we, the savior communist revolution of Russia, are going to wipe out the kulaks, who were pretty much like the equivalent of a immigrant group who had over a few generations kind of succeeded to an extent where they had become successful at, like, within the economy, and were no longer considered like essentially serfs, right? So pretty much what happened is the Russian revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, right? I'm not sure if anybody has seen the term Bolshevik floating around, but that's who the revolutionary Russians were. They were the Bolshevik army. They pretty much they launched a revolutionary coup on the Tsarist regime, which by all accounts, from what I have read in the Gulag, Tsarist Russia didn't sound so bad, right? Anyway, the revolutionaries thought so. So they came in and destroyed the whole country, killed millions of people, put a lot of people in the gulags, not everybody, but a good number of Russians ended up in the gulags, which were the early rendition of concentration camps, which Hitler, I believe it has been recorded that Hitler got his idea for his concentration camps from the Russian communists, the communist revolutionaries, right? So in that period of time, in the 1920s of Russia's revolution, the Bolshevik army used one of the arguments that was used was that the Tsarist regime was imperialist, and thus anybody who supported the Tsarist regime was also a supporter of imperialism, essentially, and we're going to do away with imperialism by basically imperializing the nation, which with our ideology, right? Because we already live here is kind of the thing. So you're not like actually really imperializing, but you're coming in with your ideology and using that as an imperialization tactic. Anyway, basically that's what happened, right? The Bolsheviks came in, they said, you imperialist tsarists, and then they kind of like just took over, and now we have modern day Russia, right? Russia never really recovered from that. And I think that it is worth noting that today in America, the United States of America, we have people running around also using that same argument. Now, am I as familiar with the history of Russia as I am with the United States? No, I'm not. And I, quite frankly, I'm not very sure what they meant with like the whole you're imperializing people, because Russia obviously lived in this Russia was Tsarist Russia was around for quite some time before these guys decided to throw their communist revolution, right? So, was the imperialist accusation from the 1920s Bolsheviks legit? Not really sure about that. It sounds to me, from my observations and my current knowledge, that imperialism is being used as a common Marxist kind of go-to, right? So that's what it would seem. Anyway, either way, it's a similarity, right? Whether or not both accusations are justified, it's a similarity in the two movements, period. Okay, moving forward. They claim, as in these leftist Marxist groups, they claim that the leading cause behind state-sanctioned violence, as they put it, of police departments and civil justice systems is basically the fact that America is built on white supremacy. Here I have a video of Patrisse Cullors pretty much endorsing the Breathe Act and talking about how we really need to, pass the Breathe Act because people are dying in the streets. Everybody's getting killed in the streets, says Patrisse Cullors. And basically, my take on that from a perspective of communism, because Patrisse Cullors has said that she is a trained Marxist, which means that she understands Marxism and has been trained in Marxism, not just economically, but how do you implement a Marxist regime, right? I would imagine that means trained Marxism, especially considering what we see happening today. So basically what we're seeing here is the modern class struggle, right? So the class struggle is kind of basically what Marxism is founded on. It is the idea that all throughout history, civilization has been a documentary basically of class struggles, of a ruling class against an oppressed class, and that history has repeatedly shown that the oppressed class will continue to try and rise up out of that oppression, right? So there's that. Anyway, so pretty much this whole argument of the United States being an imperialist, murderous, white supremacist nation based on white supremacist ideology is that it is pretty much the modern class struggle, right? That's what they're using as the class struggle leverage, because in order to have a communist revolution, you need to have people who feel oppressed enough to overthrow the existing, political system and regime, whatever you want to call it. in America, we call it a democratic republic is what we call it in America. Anyway, so basically, they claim that America's the entirety of the social, political, and economic impact, this basically the disparities in America are founded on the concept of white supremacy and thus must be dismantled, which is a key part of their pitch, is that we have to dismantle this racist nation. So basically, this is kind of where these groups are congregating, is the white supremacy argument. And if you disagree with them, then you're a white supremacist, probably, because how could you not see it? It's such an obvious fact, basically. Now, this is where things get really interesting, is the hijacking of a legitimate need for police reform by a communist movement. So, like I said, a lot of what this movement is doing is identifying something that Americans kind of acknowledge as a necessary reform, right? Like, it's pretty hard. You'd have to be kind of psychotic, right, to view the George Floyd video and say, oh yeah, that was justified, because I mean, I trained jiu-jitsu, and that's not something that you do, right? Like, you know better to do that. And I would think as a police officer, you would know better than to do that. So the fact that happens, right? The fact that happens with George Floyd. I live in Colorado, where Elijah McClain was involved in an officer-involved death. He died, and he was reportedly mentally ill. Not I mean, he was a great person, and he wasn't some sort of crazy guy trying to rob people. He was just a kid walking down the street, right? And for some reason, well, he had a mask on, but that was part of his that's part of who he was, right? It was part of his condition. And so I live here in Colorado where that happened, in Aurora PD, and there's obviously investigations going on and all this stuff. But the fact that this happens, I think Americans kind of universally acknowledge that we need to kind of police our police a little better, right? And this kind of universally acknowledged need was then leveraged as a class struggle opportunity by these leftist groups. So that's kind of what we're seeing here, but that's kind of only the first phase of what I'm calling communist radicalization, because you have to think about it. It's not normal for people to go out and protest 86 days in a row. It's not normal for people to go and just kind of randomly decide that we're going to loot downtown Chicago. That's not a normal thing. I know the new normal is one of the new favorite phrases going around today, but quite frankly, that's not normal. That's a sign of some serious issues, right? And so I think it's worth looking at how much these protests and social media propaganda accounts are being utilized to radicalize people. So the phase 2 of radicalization basically is is protests as recruiting grounds. So protests as recruiting grounds, basically what that means is people go to a protest as a concerned civilian, right? But at these protests, what happens? There's people speaking, and they're usually reciting very radical left talking points. Things like abolish the police. We'll use community groups, right, to police the police, and we'll have civilians who are responsible for taking the police's place. There's a whole argument around it, right? So there's the abolish the police argument, right? And then there's also the free all prisoners thing, right? Free all prisoners. Also, there is let's see. Oh yeah, cancel rent debt, right? These are all talking points that if you listen to BLM talks, if you listen to Antifa, if you listen to what is spoken at For the People protests, which I have personally witnessed, right? you can see that this is kind of like a trend through all these groups, and that basically when people go to these protests and they listen to all this stuff, they kind of get exposed to a very radical philosophy without being told first that it's radical, right? They're thinking, well, these people put on this protest and, they're fighting for what's right, and here's their solutions, and, they've thought a lot about this. And so I haven't thought about it at all. And so I kind of trust them. It's kind of like, in my opinion, what the psychological component of all of this is. Obviously, I'm not a psychologist. That's kind of just my perspective on this, like why people are doing that. But the fact of the matter is, people are going to these protests. They're listening to these talks that are very radical, and also at these protests, they get social media information for these accounts, like the Youth Liberation Front, Black Lives Matter, whatever region. Black Lives Matter Chicago is a pretty good example of a chapter that posts regularly pretty radical left propaganda and is heavily shared. Right. Also, we have exchanging information with other activists. So now you're building a community. Now you have friends who are also just as interested in doing the right thing as you are, because that's how it's presented, is you're presenting a solution to white supremacy, right? So a few of these things are actually listed as some of the, like a few of these points that I've mentioned have actually been known to be utilized by extremist groups, such as, for example, extremist groups such as and when I say this, I mean Islamic extremists, like real, like legitimate terror groups. Their propaganda and their method of recruiting is kind of actually, interestingly, very similar, in the sense that they basically look for marginalized, disenfranchised, and alienated groups, or alienated individuals, right? Which, if you look at Black Lives Matter and this Marxist movement, what are they doing? They're looking for marginalized, disenfranchised, and alienated individuals. For example, Black trans lives, Black queer lives, brown and black and brown bodies are all common terms used by this movement, right? So we kind of see that these groups are being kind of sought after and uplifted by this movement, which I had thought was very interesting until I had come across the work of, I can't find her name in my notes. Oh no. Erin Marie Saltman is her name. She is a counter-terror expert and identity extremist expert. And so I listened to a few of her talks, and these are some of the points that she was kind of going over. She's saying that they're called push and pull factors. One of the recruiting, obviously, factors were those three that I listed off: marginalized, disenfranchised, and alienated. Also, one of the steps to radicalization included things like creating a utopian caliphate, which is like obviously Islamic extremist term. But if you kind of take out the Islamic aspect of it, which would be the caliphate, if you look at just like the utopian aspect of it, very similar to what kind of is going on with this Marxist movement. We also see like the promise of prosperity and economic inclusion, which is an enormous factor in the Black Lives Matter umbrella, right? Is that our class has been marginalized for so long that it has caused economic disparities in today's society, right? So very interesting, the similarities that are drawn here. These are actually, like I said, Islamic extremist examples of push and pull factors used for recruiting. Now, I don't have any of this. This is all stuff that I'm taking off of notes for my next article. I just thought that it kind of fit in what I was talking about here, so I thought I would include it. Anyway, so there's going to be a blog on all of this coming soon. But that said, the fact of the matter is that the George Floyd movement kind of spurred like thousands of Americans to basically attend like these protests around the country. Everybody gets there, Now they're part of a community, right? If you are a Black trans queer person, or like a Black American who does feel that the history of America has put you at a disadvantage, right? This is a perfect opportunity to hear people kind of speak the same thoughts that you've had, maybe privately. Also, you can connect with other people. You're now part of a community of like-minded social justice warriors who want to do good. Lots of push and pull factors in this, the way this is happening in protests, right? Another thing that is worth noting here is that social media accounts and activist influencers are also heavily leveraged by these communist movement leaders to spread awareness of far left political agenda items, such as defunding and abolishing the police. Many of you guys remember, if you were following the media cycle, sometimes the stuff doesn't even make it to the media. You have to be on Twitter to get the news. But basically, there was this like 8 to Abolition infographic that was going around. I don't know who put it out, which group it was specifically, but it was very popular. And it was right before all these policies popped up in New York and Denver and California to basically defund the police and abolish the police, right? Seattle was an example of one of those cities that actually pushed that, like, those proposals through. So very interesting to see how social media is used to manipulate the movement in a certain direction. For those of us who are on Twitter, it's hilarious because you always see this stuff happen on Twitter first. All the time. You see it happen on Twitter, and then it goes from Twitter to, like, maybe, I don't know, Instagram or YouTube. It probably goes to YouTube first. It goes to probably Twitter and then YouTube and then Instagram, and then Facebook is like the last one to get it. If it makes it on Facebook, it like made the news, right? So basically what's happening is social media is being used by these groups to manipulate the tides of the movement, right? So you notice, if you guys listen to my Chicago riots segment, then you know that social media had a direct hand in inciting that riot. There was a rumor that was spread on social media that would completely manipulated the facts of what happened in that officer-involved shooting to make the community think that a 15-year-old had been shot and killed, when in actuality it was a 20-year-old who had shot a police and was just fine he wasn't just fine, he had gotten shot, but he was alive in the hospital. So social media is being used to manipulate the movement, right? So that means that, this radicalization is not just coming from the protests, but it is being kind of, the protests are definitely being influenced by social media, for sure. It would seem that the organizers of the accounts that push these propagandized changes in the movements, we transform, right? Or a new bill comes out, or a new propaganda comes out from these select few primary accounts. Suddenly the protests react. The way people react, and just like as regular activists change. For example, we saw this with the USPS thing. We saw claims of the USPS kind of conspiracy theory happening maybe a week, 2 weeks before. I started seeing people on Instagram share artwork from influencers involved with the Black Lives Matter movement about USPS, which is really interesting. Also, I think it's worth noting that Patrisse Cullors has her current name on Twitter as defund the police, fund the post office, or something like along those lines. Basically, her account is pushing this whole post office thing, which is interesting, right? So anyway, that's a side note. Basically, what I think is happening is that this radicalization is basically being pushed because people are saying that you're being heroic for ending white supremacy. That's pretty cut and dry. That's what they say that they're doing. And then also they say that they're just like, that this is like a battle of good versus evil, right? Which is something that you actually saw said at the Democrat convention last night, which was August 20th. Joe Biden's like whole stupid speech was about, this is about light versus dark and good versus evil. Like, talk about distilling a complex subject into a matter of this side is good and this side is evil. Pretty interesting, in my opinion. So this movement kind of, at least like the Black Lives Matter movement, Antifa, for the people, by the way, they kind of organize under the Black Lives Matter flag, at least from what I've seen in person. So basically, we have this idea that from the Black Lives Matter people that this movement is about the good and righteous and oppressed facing off against the evil imperialist oppressors, right? So, very interesting distillation there. And then finally, we have some examples of radicalization seen in the movement. Like I said, I like to provide sources. I like to provide you guys with like ways to check my work. So, examples of radicalization include: 1. Utilizing protests and social media accounts to build rapport with concerned citizens, activists, and disenfranchised individuals. So here we have, if you guys can't see it, I'll explain it for you, but if you guys are watching, you can see it. The Chicago Community Bond Fund, which said that they stand in solidarity with everybody who took to the streets at the protests, and they are prepared to pay bond money for anybody that may need it. So the looters and rioters are getting bailed out by the Chicago Community Bond Fund. Then we have the NLG Chicago, who I'm assuming is the National Lawyers Guild of Chicago. And they have said that they confirmed the release of 18 people arrested during the riots, and that 2 people were still in custody at the street address, basically. And that they continue to work with organizers, the Cook County Defender and the Chicago Bond Fund, which is the Community Bond Fund, to confirm their release. Okay, so obviously we have the National Lawyers Guild bailing out rioters, the Chicago Community Bond Fund paying the money for it, which basically allows people to go out and loot and riot without having to kind of sit in jail and think about why that's maybe wrong, right? Instead, they get rewarded for it. They're treated like political heroes. So then we have the promotion of radical left doctrine to followers using social media, propaganda, and speeches at protests. I touched on this already, but I thought that this would be a good chance to provide an example. Y'all, I really couldn't believe it. But there it is. Books recommended. This was retweeted by Black Lives Matter Chicago is how I found it. Books that they should be reading. Claudia Jones' School for Political Education. Includes, guys. Let's see here. The Black Bolshevik. And we just talked about who the Bolsheviks were, right? They killed and imprisoned a bunch of people because it was their proletariat right. Really read the Gulag Archipelago before you make it an opinion to join the Black Bolshevik, right? Read the Gulag, okay? Just wow, okay? This is insane. The Bolshevik army was probably the most violent revolutionary army that we probably, have on record. There was some crazy stuff that was done. They regularly put their political opponents in work camps for 25-year sentences. Like anybody. There was a period of time where anybody who pretty much got arrested made it into a gulag camp for 25 years, which is like a jail, but a work camp, right? So, Black Bolshevik, one of the recommended political education reading books, right? Black Bolshevik. The little sideline here is Autobiography of an Afro-American Communist. Let Me Live, Angelo Herndon, right? A prison autobiography of an African-American labor organizer and social activist. That one's not as radical of a cover, right? But I don't know very much about that individual, so I couldn't tell you if that's radical or not. But we do have another one here, which I thought was interesting. We have Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones. She sounds great. She sounds great. Left of Karl Marx. I don't know if these guys studied, like, the history of communism, like, and what happened to people. I don't know if they just think that maybe they're the ones who are going to get it right. Like, maybe we have learned enough from the failed attempts at communism that this time we're going to get it right. And I'm like, no, you guys are freaking nuts. You are not that. I'm sorry. I'm sure you guys are really smart people. I'm sure you are, and I'm sure that you're very well educated and that you have this super well thought out. That said, communism has failed every time it was tried. Every single time, okay? Like, I had a high school teacher once who said history doesn't repeat itself. Stupid people repeat history. And I'm like, yes. Now I really get what you were talking about, Mr. Iceland. A freaking smart guy. Anyway, so I just thought that that would be interesting that these are books that are being recommended to people that are obviously communist books about being a communist and not being, I don't know, successful in your communist efforts. And like, I don't know, maybe I should just buy the books and read them. I don't think I would buy them. Maybe I'd buy them from a used bookstore if I saw them there, or like eBay. I don't think I'm going to donate any money to these authors. That's capitalism for you. Anyway, so here we have more posts. Post from Black Lives Matter Chicago. This one is a campaign to provide weekly information on historical fascism and its direct link to the U.S. settler colonial state in 2020. Wow. Wordsmiths. Anyway. So, another thing that I noticed as like a radicalization point was the mobilization of activists being encouraged, particularly like suggesting that these activists get involved in their community specifically to support the radical left agenda items that are being brought forth by the movement's organizers. These, these, like, I guess, community action points include things like calling city council officials, going to city council meetings. Here in Denver, we saw the city council have to do a remote session because so many Black Lives Matter advocates, one of which is Tay Anderson, who is a Denver school board director, in which they pretty much like occupied city council and decided that they were going to do like talk after talk after talk on their subject points instead of just having like a representative come in and respectfully present the issues. They decided that they were going to mob rule city council of Denver. And I know that that has happened in many cases, just south of Denver, Pueblo, Colorado. It's been a little bit more of a democratic republic decision-making process where city council has actually like come in and gotten people to like stop protesting over the statue, and now they're like mediating, which is a big step from having statues just like torn down, right, and then shoved into a garage somewhere or something until this all blows over. So anyway, basically these protesters are being encouraged to organize and take direct action, whether violent or non-violent, by these social media accounts, basically these organizer social media accounts. So here we have a post from the PDX Black Youth Movement, which basically says, come march with us for police abolition. This is in Portland. Masks required. It says hosted by PDX Black Youth Movement. So yeah, obviously, like, come protest. I don't know who makes these posters, and that's what I'm also really interested in, is who's like taking the time to graphic design all of this, right? This takes time. Then we have something here in Chicago where Asha Rosa, who I'm not really sure who she is, but anyway, she is saying, Chicago, come out to one of the Defund CPD direct action training series, online or in person. Register for any of the trainings here. The first one is a virtual direct action training for Black folks, only on Saturday. Black is capitalized, obviously. And then we have Defund CPD direct action training series. These trainings will offer space for folks with an X to build confidence, excitement, and preparation for participating in and leading protest actions. The movement to defund CPD is not over. Come be a part of organizing and develop skills to demand that 75% of CPD's current $1.8 billion budget be spent in funding Chicago's communities, not police. This says it is organized by Blackout Collective, dissenters, and I'm not sure who this other group is here. It's like band something, but I can't make out the bottom half of their logo. Anyway, so those are the people who organize this, and this is one of the most interesting. I'm glad you guys stuck around because this is interesting. The next point I'm going to make here is the fact that these organizations, specifically Black Lives Matter, is now making reading and learning material for youth, including young adult books. For example, Patrice Cullors, the self-proclaimed trained Marxist, this is her tweet right here. She says, the young adult adapted version of my memoir, When They Call You a Terrorist, publishes on September 22nd, and you can pre-sale right now. Hashtag When They Call You a Terrorist. I mean, so basically, it's the story of Black Lives Matter and the power to change the world. Right? Okay, so this is interesting. Obviously, in America, we have freedom of the press. You can publish a book, and you can publish a book for youth. Can you publish a book if you're declared a domestic terrorist? I'm not really sure about that. I don't know the legal, like how that works there, but I think it's interesting and worth noting and bringing to attention that the organizer of Black Lives Matter, self-proclaimed trained Marxist, is writing books for your youth, America. Interesting stuff right there. All right, so we also have Patrice Cullors thanking Teen Vogue. She has actually been featured in Teen Vogue. That's a pretty well-known fact. Other points that I have here is obviously sharing and encouraging radical left books. Also calls to violent direct action in the name of justice for the proletariat, which they say are Black Africans. Which they say are Black Americans and people of color in the U.S. So, yeah, I mean, if you guys take some time to just look up some information on, like, distinguishing characteristics of communist movements, if you take some time to look at communist policy and, like, political history, I think you'd find it interesting. I'm obviously going to do a series on that. I am kind of taking my time to get there, to be honest, because I want to report on a lot of these things that are happening now. But obviously, getting information out about, like, the real history of communism in the United States, I don't think that has been well done here in the West, specifically North America. So probably worth doing, something I'm going to think about. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. If you guys enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing, liking. If you guys are watching this on BitChute, please consider sending a $5 donation. I do this 100% free. I don't take any money from any corporations or sponsors because I want to not have any outside influence in what I talk about. I like to have that kind of autonomy. So if you guys do enjoy my journalism, please consider donating and supporting me. Also, if you guys don't have any cash, times are tough right now, subscribing and sharing is super awesome. Anyway, thank you guys. I hope that you have a great weekend. Happy Friday, everybody. Bye.